With Daryl. Daryl worked for the state government for many years. He's retired now. I know he looks too young to be retired, but he worked in natural resource management, and it's always fascinating to hear what Daryl's got to say about some of the experiences you've had, because you've seen many droughts, you've seen many floods over the time, but it's all about that managing those resources. So where do you see the current environment in terms of some of that natural resource management? It's a pretty open-ended question, I know.
At the moment, I think, Matthew, we're going through a pretty hard time with drought, and I think that's connected to climate change. Some people think it's just natural, but I think this time there's just too many things happening about climate change. The last year was the hottest year in Australia that's been under record, 2018. I think the hottest year in New South Wales as well, on record. So things are changing, but the drought is probably the major thing. But natural resource management, I think there's a lot of good things happening with that. There's some fairly disastrous things with the recent things at Menindee. But overall, I think the landholder, the general purpose, general population is much more aware and doing reasonably good things. Some people get caught in situations that are not of their own making, but a lot of the times it's just that intent to do better is probably the most important thing.
And so you have dealt with a lot of farmers in your time, obviously,
yep.
And you've probably seen their knowledge of their land improve dramatically over that time.
Yeah, when I worked for Western Catchment Management Authority, our main emphasis was on maintaining ground cover. And some of the dust storms coming through at the moment, there's not much ground cover out west. But the landholders really took that on board, and as best they could, their emphasis was on managing their ground cover and keeping some cover on the ground, both as feed for their stock, but also to protect their resources and manage it into the future. If you've got ground cover, you'll have better moisture infiltration when it does rain. You have less dust storm, less soil erosion, obviously, and you've got feed for your stock. So you're doing a lot of good things by ground cover maintenance, and landholders generally adopted that as one of their main key areas of operation. But that brings up another thing, that their management depended on managing all the grazing animals, and that included kangaroos, rabbits, pigs, goats, plus their domestic stock. Well, some have goats as domestic stock as well, which is fine. But you've got to manage the whole lot, and sometimes that's a little bit difficult, particularly when stress periods come on.
Yeah. And it's always popular to talk about it in some circles that you've got to cull some kangaroos to protect what you've got in terms of your environment.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, kangaroos and pigs, rabbits are not much a problem these days, except in some certain areas, but generally kangaroos and pigs and goats, uncontrolled, unmanaged goats, are still a major problem.
And just as much you can overgraze with sheep and cattle, you can overgraze with too many kangaroos.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So one of the real challenges there is, it makes sense what you're saying, ground cover, and I've visited a lot of farms around the electorate and just talked to people who've got a whole range of different views around what you're talking about. And it sounds great in theory, but when you've got no rain, it makes it a bit harder to maintain that ground cover.
Yeah, I think it is really difficult, but if you can control, and a lot of people are doing, I guess, what they call total grazing pressure fencing these days. And when I was in the CMA, and I know that the local land services now are providing some assistance to have exclusion fencing. You can if you've got exclusion fencing, you can actually manage the stock within that area, and you're not going to remove all the roos or perhaps all the goats even, but you can actually manage the stock. But if you haven't got that, it is really difficult, and you've got to, I guess, develop systems of either shooting, and that's often, if you're in drought, that's a difficult situation, or getting rid of your domestic stock, and that's sometimes hard. People think that they have the best stock in the world, but by and large, you're better off selling early. There's an old adage about drought: sell early and regret, but sell early. Yeah. And people don't do that all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah, and obviously it's easy to say that again. People hold on to their stock, and then they look at what they've got and they've gone, I've left it too late. The really difficult part there, when I've spoken to farmers about that, is sure, it's great if you've got a crystal ball and you know when that rain's going to come and how long this drought's going to be, but when you're in the middle of it, that makes it pretty tough.
It's when to sell is the really difficult thing, and I think the good operators, and there's a lot of good operators out there that have systems where they actually assess how much feed they've got in front of them, good food in front of them for their stock, and they make decisions perhaps 2 to 6 months before, saying if we don't get rain by a certain date, I'm going to sell, and they sell, and either if they get rain after that, well, that's bad luck, but if they don't, well, they're in a much better position than hanging on to them till they get to dying in the paddock or unsaleable product.
Yeah. And so one of the things that I've thought about as I've gone around and talked to people, there are differences there where some farmers seem to be able to manage through a drought like this in a better way. I'm not saying it's perfect, but in a better way than other farmers. Some of that shared education, and some people are doing it the same way that they've done it for generations. Some people are taking a more progressive or more modern approach to it. But I think that education is really important, and I'm not sure whether there is enough of that shared knowledge out there.
Yeah, I think the opportunity is there. I don't think all people want to know some of the knowledge. I know some people that are really progressive and they just have great businesses. Their agriculture business is really great, but there are others who don't want to know. Sometimes it's difficult to have the confidence to make some of those decisions and to gain that knowledge. We had this is a bit off the topic, but we had a philosophy, I guess, in the CMA that you actually needed 3 things to get a change occurring in an individual or a population. 1, you had to have the knowledge of what was the best thing to do. 2, you had to have the motivation to actually do it. So there had to be some presumably monetary advantage or personal advantage or ease of life advantage, something like that. And thirdly, you had to have the capacity to actually do it. So now the capacity to say get stock off a property is really good. Back in the 40s when there was major droughts in Australia or in New South Wales, people didn't have the capacity to get stock off the property. Now they do have that capacity. They can get rid of them. You can get a truck in within a couple of days and truck them to Dubbo or to Sydney or wherever you want to take them to. So that capacity is actually there. But those 3 things of actually having the knowledge of what to do, how to do it, the motivation to do it, and sometimes I guess inertia overcomes motivation. So that's always difficult. And then the capacity to actually do it, and that might be monetary or knowledge or understanding of how to do something as much as just the monetary capacity to do something.
And I think point 1 there is something that a good state government could really help in by having that shared knowledge and taking some examples of farmers that have gone through this drought in a reasonable condition and taking their stories and sharing those out amongst the farming community, for example.
And the key message, I think we often complicate our messages. The key messages that we used to hammer when we were when I was in the CMA, and I think they continue in the local land services, is about ground cover. If you've got ground cover, you've got capacity to do things into the future. If you haven't got ground cover, you're going to lose resources. You're going to get high runoff, all those difficult things. No feed for your stock. Just it's essential.
No, it's great to have a chat with you, and certainly just the experience that you've got, that background knowledge and information you've got. It's always interesting to have a talk to you about that, and I love talking to people that have got all that background information. I'm not a farmer. I haven't worked on a farm apart from helping out friends when I was at school. I haven't worked on a farm, so I just don't have the in-depth experience of this, but it's great talking to people like you that have got that background experience.
Well, I did come from a farming background, but I'm not a farmer either, and I know it's easier to talk about than actually to do. So
yeah, that's right.
It's not always as easy as what it seems to be.
No, that's right. Yep. All right, good chat, Daryl. Thank you.